Okay, let's get started. Thank you all, both here in the Grand and on Zoom, for attending this workshop. And we want to welcome back our keynote speaker, Dr. Gina Garcia. In this workshop, she'll expand on what she presented this morning to explore how Hispanic serving institutions can benefit students of all identities and share best practices for undertaking this work. We will have Q&A towards the end, time permitting. For those here in the Grand, we have microphones at the end of each aisles and attendance. For those of us who are joining us by Zoom, we will have a moderator who will be fielding your questions in the chat room. And so with that, let's welcome back Dr. Gina Ann Garcia for this session.
There, we muted one. Okay. I am actually going to do the same session that I just did, because that was the request. So I want to make sure that that's clear, that it's not going to be a different session. It's going to be the same session, because we wanted to give people the opportunity to go to the session, even if they wanted to go to another session that was at the same time, that they could eventually come to the session. So then everybody could eventually go through the session. So if you just sat through it, you're going to have to sit through the same stuff. So I don't want to subject you to that. But the conversation is going to be around the typology of HSI organizational identities, which I presented in the keynote that I gave. It's a little 4 boxes, and I'm going to talk through how we're going to move towards getting us into understanding where you are currently as an institution when it comes to putting yourself either as Hispanic serving or Hispanic enrolling. And then at the end, I'll tell you what the other group voted, the first group voted, because I think it's important that this is a conversation. HSI, becoming a Hispanic serving institution, the way I approach the work is that it's an organizational level thing, and everybody's got to be a part of it. It's an organizational identity, so it can't just be one person's opinion of what's going on. It's got to be a collective of like, how are we going to get to HSI? How are we going to get to that point in which we're adequately serving our students in the various ways? So this workshop is intended to help you put yourself into the typology and give you some tangible ways to think about servingness beyond the designation and the federal requirement, which is only based on enrollment. So if it's only enrollment, then we need some other mechanisms for getting us to that point in which we are actually serving. So let me see. Oh, now I'm going to have to restart on my polls because I already had the other group. Maybe I won't. Maybe I will have y'all add to this one, and then I'll have a collective. I'll probably do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. I'd just like to know who is with me. So the first question is easy. It's just, who are you? What is your role on campus? And let me go ahead and share it with the full screen and start it. So I am going to keep it. So this will require you to use either a phone or you can log into an internet. I think it sounds like most of y'all are sitting in a stadium, but if you're logging in from Zoom, then you can log in and use your computer. So go ahead and either vote by text with that number, or you can join from swiftpolling.com and use that hashtag. So go ahead and indicate where you are on campus. What is your role on campus? All right, so we're moving slowly here. Not as many people maybe in this session, and that's okay. But we got a fewer non-faculty this time. Last session seemed to have a good number of faculty, which is great, of like, how are faculty going to be doing this work? But it's everybody's work, right? And so that's why I asked this question, because no matter where you're at on campus, I want you to be thinking about how are we going to become a Hispanic serving institution from where I'm at, right, in my place. So faculty have to do work in the curriculum and within the classroom. Professional staff, classified staff have to do it from where they're supporting students in other spaces. Administrators have to make decisions and policies that are going to affect servingness. So everybody matters. That's why I ask, because everybody has a role in defining servingness on campus. All right, so that's the first thing I want you to do is just think, where am I and how am I going to enact servingness or enact, becoming an HSI? This one was really fascinating for me, and I'm excited to see how it comes out more with y'all here. So this poll is asking, when you think about academic outcomes, these are those outcomes we care the most about on campus. Which ones do you generally have conversations about, particularly when you're having equity conversations? Because equity is such a big conversation right now. I want us to think about what are the important outcomes when we're having equity conversations? Because if I tell you to focus on certain outcomes, but that's not important to your mission as a college, then I'm not doing you a good service, because I'm saying you should care about, 150% graduation rates, but yet conversations around job and economic outcomes is a pretty important outcome for y'all. So I want to make sure that y'all are thinking, what outcomes matter to us, right, as a campus? Because remember what I said in the keynote is that every campus has got to become an HSI the way they're going to become an HSI. It's not, you don't want to look to the left, look to the right, find the HSI that looks like you and is doing the same work as you, but like, actually, what do we want to do? What do we need to do better to be an HSI? So go ahead and weigh in. And I'd love to hear from the other. I'm like, oh, what are the other outcomes? Not that I have all the outcomes here, but I just like to hear what else is going on. So the job and economic outcomes stayed pretty high up there, but also your graduation rates, right? Like just getting students to completion, like, whatever kind of degree they came from, getting them there. Successful transfer is usually pretty important for a community college. So that's there, obviously, but there's different outcomes that people are concerned about. So when you're having your equity conversations, this is my call to you, my task to you is to say, we're gonna think about outcomes in these complex ways. We're not going to just go to the one type of outcome, which tends to be the 150% graduation. That usually is what people are most concerned about when we're having conversations around HSI. That's the one that people are thinking about. They want the 150% graduation rate. We need to think about all of these outcomes. All of these outcomes matter if that's what we're doing, if that's in our mission. And it usually is. Most missions are complex. They're not one dimensional. It's not just one thing. It's multiple things that we're thinking about when it comes to the different types of outcomes that matter to us. So when I ask you to place yourself into the typology of HSI organizational identities, I want you to think outcomes. The last poll and this poll is the stuff that's on the left, the y-axis, which is the outcomes axis. That determines which box you're in based on these outcomes. So this one is an important one. This is in your opinion. There's no right answer. In your opinion, is the campus currently producing equitable outcomes, the ones you just talked about and the ones that you said are important, equitably across groups? Because when we talk about equity, equity is across groups. So if one group is doing really well, but another one isn't, then it's not equity. So let me go ahead and launch this one. And this is your opinion. It's strictly opinion. It's not, there's no right answer. I mean, there is a right answer, but I don't have the data to have you, answer it. So there's no right answer. It's based on like what you know currently from your position and any data you have seen. Oh, the no's are creeping up. We started at 30 and now we're just really pushing up a little bit more. All right, so it looks like we kind of came to a pause here. So the no's, and this is between the two groups. And it looked like we had more people in the last group. So we have a pretty strong, no. People are saying, I don't think we're doing good, equitable work. Now, some of y'all are in the, I'm not sure. And some of you said yes or no based on your opinions, but you didn't have necessarily the strong data to say, although usually our gut is pretty accurate. We generally know these things. And so this is the conversations. When y'all start to have the conversations about HSI, which I hope you will, I'm just starting some of these conversations. Y'all have the work. The hard work is after today. The hard work is like, what are we going to do next to get HSI moving? These are the conversations you need to have. You need to start to get the data, right? How are we going to get the data to know about outcomes? How are we going to get the data? Do we even know about our job and economic outcomes? Like, what indicators do we have about how well we're doing in that area? Because you're going to want to measure those things, but data, having some data are pretty important. So maybe if we don't have data, do we start to collect data? If we have data, what are the data looking like? So starting to think about how are we going to have these equity questions around the outcomes that matter to us towards becoming an HSI. Because as I have stressed, becoming an HSI doesn't have to be one thing. It can be multiple things. So for you to become an HSI might mean, we're doing well, 150% graduation rate, we're doing well with transfer, and we're doing well with economic and job outcomes, and workforce development, right? That could be another one. So I think of that more as like a community outcome, right? Developing the workforce is an important mission. And so those could be your things you're going for. And that might not be what, let's say, Hispanic Serving Research Institution in the state is doing. Because maybe Hispanic Serving Research Institution, they're like, we want to have more people go on to doctoral programs, right? Or we're training them to go on to graduate school, or we're having a higher number of students coming into our doctoral programs, or something to that effect. So the outcomes are different depending on the type of institution you're at, and that's okay. That's what's going to make you an HSI, to say we're going towards this one or two or three types of things. This one, we got all kind of feedback, so I want to hear some more from y'all. This is a fill in the blank. So this is, as you start to think about the bottom axis of the typology, the culture, the organizational culture part, or the climate part, I want you to think, where is it on campus? If you're a faculty member, what are the faculty spaces? What are the spaces that you have control over that students have interaction with in the curriculum, where they can see themselves, or where there's Latino studies or ethnic studies, or places where students of color are centered in the curriculum? Maybe it's women and gender studies, social work, right? There's many places where programs become spaces that center students of color. It's not just ethnic studies, but that's one. Maybe it's TRIO. We got a lot of votes for TRIO. We got a lot of votes for Office of Multicultural and Diversity Affairs. So feel free to add your own things that you want to add to say, you know what, we do a pretty good job in this space. And maybe it's your space, or maybe it's a space that you know of on campus, but you don't necessarily work in. Ooh, LUCHA, that's a new one. I didn't hear that one in the last group. I would love to hear more about that. What's a LUCHA? I mean, I know what LUCHA is, but I want to know what LUCHA is on your campus. TRIO, a good number of TRIO and the ODMA clubs and organizations. I talked about the clubs and organizations, the last one, a lot, and the importance of having clubs and organizations. The research is pretty strong that that's where students often get their sense of belonging, or they get to feel like they interact with other people like them. Dream Center, that one's new too. I didn't hear that one in the last one. I'm assuming dream as in dreamers, as in undocumented students, which is great. If there's a Dream Center, I love that. There's good ones coming up here that I didn't see from the last one. So, but let me talk a little bit as you continue. You can go ahead and continue entering, and I'll scroll. You can scroll down and see some of the other ones. What I talked to in the last group, basic needs case management. Okay, yes, I'm seeing new stuff come up. I love it. Student Reading and Writing Center, inclusive teaching faculty development programs. Okay, so y'all got some good stuff going on, it looks like, and that's great. And typically what we see at HSIs is there's spaces, right? There's spaces on campus. Y'all are naming the spaces. These are what I would call the counter spaces, right? The counter spaces is where people can go, students can go and feel like their needs are being met, whether it be around their racial, ethnic identity, or maybe it's around their, if they're low income, it's their basic needs. If they're undocumented, they're getting support around being undocumented or immigrant. If they speak multiple languages, they might feel like they get support in that way. So there's all these different spaces where they can go. My challenge to you is to start thinking, how do we broaden that so that it doesn't have to be only in a space? How does it start to become across campus? And that's hard. I'm not saying I've ever seen this. I've never seen it in reality. Not that I've visited every HSI, but I've visited a good number and worked with a good number. And it's hard to do it across the organization. That's hard to do, right? And so oftentimes it's okay that it's happening in these different spaces. So how do we start to elevate it? How do we elevate the things that TRIO does to an organizational level? I actually wrote an article about EOPS, and EOPS on one campus, they had done just that they were so successful with their EOP students that they offered EOP counseling to all students on campus. They created a model that all students got EOP counseling because EOP was so effective at what they were doing. They were so effective at serving students of color and low-income students that all their students, they assumed all students would benefit from that, that type of counseling, that high touch, high, approach to counseling. And so they have elevated it. And so everybody on campus got an EOP advisor. Even if they weren't eligible for EOP or for Pell Grant, they were still getting EOP advising because it was a good model. So how do you start to elevate some of these things to a model level rather than saying, or to an institutional level, because you already know it's a good model, rather than saying we, expect students to go over there and they do it over there, so we don't need to do it anywhere else. Because if HSI becomes organizational, then it doesn't need to be in one place or the other. It needs to be the whole organization. So how do you start to open it up to all across the campus and or scale up? The term is scale up, right? How do you scale up programs that actually work? Now, what I will say, and I didn't stress this a lot in the last one, but what I will say is I don't see a lot of curricular spaces. All right, there is a faculty development program there, but a lot of these seem like co-curricular spaces. The teaching practices is saying basically we offer equitable, inclusive teaching practices for faculty, but it's not necessarily happening. Nobody's naming where in the curriculum, although there was one person that said that ethnic studies was now new, right? That now y'all had a newer, that it was newer, but that ethnic studies was becoming a thing. Ethnic studies is not the only place, right? Like one day, my dream is that when I ask this, people say chemistry. In chemistry, they center students of color. In math, they do it over there in math. They do social justice approach to math over there, and it's amazing, right? Like they do it over there in anthropology. That's where they're doing the centering of students of color, and they're doing a great job. That's the goal, right? That would be that point in which we got it to an organizational level. Because right now, based on these, and this is with all of the last group, it's very co-curricular. For the most part, most of these are co-curricular. They're not happening in the curricular spaces. Trio STEM, has some STEM in there, but is it happening in the STEM curriculum? Because that's when it would be truly at an organizational level. So if you're a faculty member, I think I had more faculty in the last one. I probably should have said it in the last one. But the faculty need to start thinking, how do I get this into my curriculum, even if I teach a program, like I teach a discipline that has nothing to do with ethnic studies or students of color? How does it start to be about them? Because all programs can be, that's the idea of being culturally relevant and centering students in the way in the curriculum. But how do you get to that point? And so that's what I would challenge y'all to think about, is how do we start to get into all of the curricular spaces? Because right now it seems like a very co-curricular approach. So I didn't talk a lot about racism and microaggressions in the talk, but it is an important conversation because right now in HSI research, there's a lot of research coming out that's saying students of color experience microaggressions at HSIs. And so we don't want that, right? If you have students who are reporting instances of racism and microaggression, then you might not be an HSI, and particularly if it's your Hispanic students. But even if it's your Black students, right? Your Black students shouldn't be experiencing racism at an HSI. If you're really a minority serving institution, you've got to think about, race and racism and the ways in which it's showing up. So this one's hard, I know. Maybe you haven't witnessed it, maybe you're unsure. It's okay. And witnessed, and or maybe you were told, right? Maybe somebody told you. Students could have told you, or faculty and staff. This happens to faculty and staff in college campuses as well. So we need to validate that this happens to faculty and staff too. Administrators, anybody on campus can experience racism and microaggression. So we got to talk about it. We need to start having critical conversations about this exact topic, because if we don't, then we can't really get to that full place of servingness until we've actually grappled with some of these things, which is racism and microaggressions. It's real, right? It happens. So how do we move to a place where we're addressing this and having important conversations about it? We'll give you another minute or two or another couple seconds, 30 seconds to think about it. All right, so we're kind of split here. 29 yes. Oh, now we're tied 30-30. So about half have seen or witnessed. It doesn't mean it's not happening, right? If you haven't seen it. So, and then the yeses, if you're in the no category, should show that, right? Indicate that like, well, yeah, this is possibly happening on the campus. Just because I haven't seen it or witnessed it or experienced it doesn't mean it's not happening. Particularly if it's happening to students, we want to start to address this. This is more than anti-bias training, right? This is more than implicit bias. This is like, we've got to talk about racism. Like it can't be another name, like it's got to be the name, which is racism, right? How is racism showing up? How are microaggressions? Microaggressions tend to be racism, but they're also gender. They could be gender, or they could be other things around microaggressions as well. So we've got to start having these critical conversations. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go back to now the typology, because I want y'all to go ahead and think about it, but I want to show it to you again in case you missed it during the talk. I want to show you the typology again, because this is what we're working towards in this interactive presentation, which seemed to work out. Even though I can't hear from y'all, we're still interacting because I'm seeing y'all's votes. But what we're working towards is figuring out where in the typology does SLCC fit? Would you currently place the organization, not your own individual space, your own program in Trio or wherever you work, but the organization as a whole? How does the college as a whole fit right now? And thinking about what we just shared, and maybe you were in one place, but your colleagues were voting another way, and you're like, I haven't seen racism and microaggressions, but a lot of people said they have. So that's going to affect where you vote or put yourself in this categories, right? So if you think that equitable outcomes are currently equitable for students of color, particularly Hispanic, Latino students, you would want to go up in those top quadrants. That takes you up into like high outcomes, right? You're producing at very high levels. Lower quadrants down below would say you're not exactly producing equitable outcomes. Left and right, you would move towards the right if you're saying we have a lot of structures like the curriculum, co-curriculum, we're disrupting racism. We're moving towards enhancing or serving towards the right, or if we're not, we would stay over here down on the left side. So I'm going to stop and let y'all take this in, read all these words, a lot of words on here, just to make sure you understand these types. Okay. And you can see, I don't even have to ruin it. You can see where people in the last session voted, but place yourself where you want. It's all individual, where you think you are currently as an institution. Seems like not as much movement here. Maybe people are thinking, but Latinx enhancing still seems to come out as the strongest, which would be that you're saying you're structurally starting to do some pretty good things that are centering Latino students and really starting to think about structurally what can you do to be an HSI, but that maybe you still need to work on equitable outcomes. And remember, equitable outcomes would be any of those that matter, the 150% graduation, the transferring, the job, economic outcomes, that would all move you up into that Latinx producing or Latinx serving, which you can see some of your colleagues did think that you were already there, which is fine. Everybody gets to decide. But it seems like a lot of folks are saying we're making some progress, but we're not at Latinx serving yet, right? A good number have said we're not there yet. And even for the folks that said, I'm not sure, that's okay too. You don't have to know yet. And you can start to know a little bit more once you get into really starting to see data and start to have these critical conversations about where you're at. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for questions. I didn't leave as much time for questions in the last session, but I want to hear from y'all. I haven't got to hear from y'all. I've only had minimal conversation so far, only like 1 or 2 questions in the last session. So I want to go ahead and open it up if you have questions to go ahead and ask now.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. And for those in the Grand Theater, we do have microphones that are being circulated. And we also are tracking online. But let me start with a question for you, if I might. When you were talking in your main talk and in this workshop.
I can't hear. I think they muted the Zoom. I can't hear.
Oh, you can't hear me at all? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, now can you hear me? Oh, we're getting the feedback. Is that better? Okay. All right, let me try this question. You were talking earlier about a more inclusive curriculum, curriculum in classes other than ethnic studies like in STEM, centered around BIPOC students, Hispanic students, and what have you. And I just want to know if you have seen anything in the literature that any studies of correlation between percentages of faculty of color and inclusive curriculum centered on students of color. In other words, have you seen anything that says with more faculty of color, you will see those trends in the curriculum?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the data, the research doesn't show necessarily correlations between outcomes, but what it does show pretty strongly is that the more faculty of color you have, or that faculty of color are more likely to utilize culturally relevant curriculum, they're more likely to utilize anti-racist curriculum, they're more likely to be aware of their own biases, they're more likely to do community engaged research, they're more likely to do community service in their programs, stuff like that. So the research is pretty strong about that, and particularly in higher ed across broadly, not just HSIs. Like most of that research has been done outside of HSIs. So it makes for a strong case for why we need more faculty of color, because we absolutely do, but we want faculty of color who are more likely to do those things. And so, yeah, faculty of color are more likely, but you want to make sure that they are, right, as you're thinking about changing composition. So there is a good, strong case for why we should have more faculty of color in the classrooms.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? How about anyone from online? No? Okay, one's coming up.
Yep. Hello, my name is Brian Jesus Urrelas. Okay, there's kind of an echo. So my question was, do you have any suggestions or recommendations of what you view as a perfect example of a Hispanic Serving Institute? I also adding on that question, what aspect of a school transitioning to a Hispanic Serving Institute do you believe is the most important? In the last workshop I just attended, we talked about changing curriculum, syllabuses, having trainings for faculty to be more aware about Latinx communities and their experiences. So my question would be, if you had a perfect example of a school that you would recommend to look into and to maybe model after, and which aspects of it should you go first in becoming a Hispanic Serving Institute? I don't know if I worded that correctly, but yeah.
I heard bits and pieces of it. I don't know if our moderator, did you hear it all?
Let me see if I can rephrase it. I think that the questioner was asking you if there were institutions that you could recommend as models to look at, I guess from the standpoint of the actual outcomes.
Yeah. Model HSIs, I like to not go with the model HSIs because for one, there isn't a good model. And that is part of my whole reason why I stress, you got to become the HSI that you're going to become, right? And in many ways, there's the opportunity to become the best one or the model one because everybody's still trying to figure it out, right? HSI is such a new thing and everybody's still trying to figure out what does it mean? How do you define servingness? And even with someone like me who's been providing a lot of tools, a lot of frameworks for defining it, a lot of ways to think about it. My research has only been in the last less than 10 years, right? Like 2015 and beyond, I would say, where we have really solid HSI research. So it's such a new thing, right? We're still trying to figure it out. So there's not a lot of good models, but I will say that I did learn a lot from the folks that I worked with. I wrote an edited book. It's called Servingness in Practice, Defining Servingness in Practice. Let me get it. I'll show it to y'all. This is the other book. So I talked about becoming HSIs today, but this is the other book, Hispanic Serving Institutions in Practice, Defining Servingness at HSIs. This book actually is edited. I edited it, but all the chapters are written by Title V and Title III directors. So it's Title V is the HSI grants and Title III is another form of HSI grants, but they're STEM focused. So these are written by all the directors and all the implementers, and they basically talk about their, journey, sometimes struggles of implementing HSI grants, but also with the call for the chapters, I asked chapter authors to talk about outcomes, right? Like, what outcomes are you seeing? And so outcomes could be anything, right? Like, I'm really big on that. I hope y'all get that at the end of this. And I'm saying outcomes could be a lot of things. The things that you're doing really well can be measured in a lot of different ways. And so the book, they talk about their structures. What did they do differently? And then what was the outcome of them changing the structure? So this book, I would say, is a good practical resource. If you're, are looking for a good resource, the Becoming HSI is good, but this one is because it comes from practice. And I stress that because I am a researcher and I spend a lot of time in my head and I spend a lot of time theoretically thinking, and I spend a lot of time with HSIs too, but this is written by people who are doing it every single day. And I've done it. I was an HSI Title V grant coordinator, so I know it's hard. And so the folks that wrote these chapters, to even ask them to write these chapters was a lot because they're like trying to do it, right? They're on the ground doing it and then also trying to write about it. So that would be one resource I would share as far as like resources. The other resource I would share and hope that y'all will get engaged with is the Alliance of HSI Educators, AHSIE. They have an annual conference. It's actually coming up in New Mexico, and they have once a year best practices conference. So that's what they call it. It's like people show up and they talk about their best practices. So ASI is a great resource, even if you can't attend the conference, just getting involved with ASI and learning what they're doing, because they provide help with grant writing. They do grantsmanship workshops. They do, different panels and stuff throughout the year, in addition to the conference when they talk specifically about best practices. So that's the other resource I encourage HSIs to get involved with is the Alliance of HSI Educators.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I have another question that I don't know if I will be able to pose it as well, but there, during this morning and this afternoon, we've talked about the Hispanic diaspora. In other words, that there's so much diversity under the umbrella term and imposed term Hispanic, and we've been talking about building the kinds of institutions that help students thrive, essentially, is what we're after with all of those elements. If you could speak a little bit about engaging the external communities and the credibility of HSIs, what could be pitfalls from the standpoint of the external community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll plug the book again. There's actually a good chapter in this book about that, and it's written by folks at the University of Arizona who are actually doing pretty good work. So if there are some models, I'll point them out. University of Arizona, they're doing great community work. HSI, as I first started exploring HSI and the typology, actually, which was my dissertation research, there was a lot of early on, in the research was a lot of conversations around the importance of engaging with the community. That HSIs were working with communities, that they were getting these HSI grants to give back to the community. That some of the grants that they used to offer pretty big grants, like in USDA, different areas where like you could could do work with like food insecurities, right? In the community, you could do work with, one of the institutions I work with, they talked about their HSI grant. They were using it to do lactation consulting with the Spanish speaking community. They were working with Spanish speaking mothers to provide lactation services to help women understand, one, the benefit of nursing their children, their babies, and then also supporting that work, because that's hard. It's hard to do. And so it is an important construct, and it does come out like you could get HSI funding to do that kind of work. I think the pitfalls question is a good one, and I think that's why I think about this chapter, because the authors in the chapter, they wrote about how there's different types of community engagement, how it should be mutually beneficial, but there's different levels to it, right? There's varying levels to like how beneficial it is to the institution, to the community, to the students, and that you should be thinking of all that, right? That like you want to benefit the community. If you're going to work with the community and external partners, there's got to be some sort of benefit, mutual benefit to it. It shouldn't only be serving of the institution. And so the research is pretty strong, as they pulled in this chapter, around centering the community, right? Like, what are the organizations you're thinking about working with, and how do you pull them in before you go after the grant, that they should be a part of the grant deciding, right? That they start to help to think about it and brainstorm around, what do we need as a community before you as an institution say, this is what we think you need, right? Because we often think we know what people need, but then we ask them and it's like, no, that's not exactly what I need, right? Like, this is what I need. So working with the community to understand what are the community needs, and how do we provide it in an effective way so that it is, it is mutually beneficial. It's beneficial for the organization, it's beneficial for the students, and it's beneficial for the community. So yeah, that should always be led by those external partners and or in collaboration, for sure. Because that's the biggest pitfall, is when the institution wants to serve a community that doesn't want to be served. Some communities are like, we're good, we're serving ourselves, thanks. So to expect and to assume that communities want your help is problematic. As colleges and universities, we're good at doing that. We think we're doing all the good and saving people, and those folks are like, yeah, no, we don't want to be saved, we don't want to be served. But when you're ready to partner with us, that's a different conversation versus you coming in and doing any kind of saving. So yeah, I think there's a lot of pitfalls to think about. This chapter has a some good things to think about, but there's lots of books written about that, higher ed, how to engage in meaningful ways with communities. So I do encourage that to be a part of your serving mess, for sure.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions, either on Zoom or in the, I see a hand over there. Can someone get a microphone?
Sure. Hi, my name is Rene Zamora Cepeda. So earlier, when you did your original, I was struck by counter story and third space. Those terms are the first time I've heard of them, and I was wondering if you could recommend some examples of what I'm trying to do is imagine kind of some outreaching to address basic needs and security and respond, to students that are kind of having that, and maybe sounds like maybe counter story might be something interesting, and if you knew of some examples or something that really has touched you or moved you and you could recommend.
Yes, I think the question was about counter stories, right? Like examples of good counter stories and how I learned that method. So my favorite is Derek Bell. So Derek Bell is one of the founders of critical race theory. Not the only, there's others. Richard Delgado is also named as a pretty important founding person in critical race theory. Counter storytelling comes from critical race methodology. So I'll put that out there because I know there's contentious arguments around critical race theory. So it is a critical race method. It comes from critical race methodology, but Derek Bell is the first person I ever read actually writing counter stories. And Derek Bell wrote 2 books. One's called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I can't remember the other one. I think the second one is called And Still We Are Not Saved, something to that effect. Derek Bell, would be the leader, I would say. And if you I've read both of those books, and they're stories, right? They're stories, they're narratives, but they're grounded in truth. They're grounded, and for him, in legal scholarship. For me, it's in the stories of my participants, it's in the empirical data, but it's told in a storytelling approach. So yeah, it comes from critical legal scholarship, but I would say Derek Bell, if you want to learn what it looks like beautifully done, Derek Bell would be the one I would recommend.
All right, thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of our time for this session. And Dr. Garcia, I just want to say on behalf of Salt Lake Community College, thank you so much for sharing your time, your scholarship, your expertise, and your wisdom with us, and for helping us to continue the conversation in the most fruitful ways. You have been an energetic and passionate mentor and guide for us, and we just want to express how much we appreciate your helping us, on this journey. And so, for those in our session, let's give Dr. Garcia a round of applause.